neighbors are trusted. And so there's a beautiful opportunity for us to be a salt and light right where we live, because people aren't on the defensive, because we're not like coming from an organization or whatever. We're neighbors. And
Right.
so there's a, we're called to pursue the common good. And I think when we do, I think we can gain a hearing and have more trust, so that people maybe want to hear the source of hope inside of us.
Well, and that's a good point. And I think sometimes we just want to show people a sermon, and then maybe then that's all it takes, and then their lives change and they get saved. And obviously, preaching is important. But like you said,
Yes.
if your neighbors don't trust you, then that message is going to fall on deaf ears, and
that's right.
It's like the saying that if people don't care about what you know till they know that you care,
That's good. Yeah.
So I love this idea, because this does, like what you were saying, creates that trust with our neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
And like you talk about in the book, you can't really choose your neighbors. There are all kinds of different people. But when we pursue the common good, like what you're saying, then they begin to trust us and Christianity. So how would you say that we can prevent difficult times from making us have a scarcity mindset?
Boy, that's the $1 million question, Matthew. You think of the Israelites when they were in exile in Babylon, and all they just curled in on themselves and wanted to leave and head back.
Correct.
And God said, lift your heads up. You're called to be a blessing to all nations. I want you to pursue the well-being. You look at the early church, the churches in Asia Minor who were being persecuted, and Peter wrote a letter to him, and he's like, listen, I get it. You want to curl in, right? You're being persecuted for your faith. And he said, no, there's nothing illegal about doing good. Mm-hmm. And so do good to the people around you. So it seems like God, whenever his people want to like have a scarcity mindset or close in because times are tough, God sends a letter or sends a message that says, you're called with a purpose. So remember who I am, remember who you are, and you can do this. So I think that's part of the key, is remembering the big picture.
Right. And so when I was reading your book, and it was talking about these different types of neighborhoods, and mm-hmm. situations that we want to get better, and how oftentimes our focus is on what is going wrong, what has happened that's bad, and what it does not have, which is really what a scarcity mindset is. When you point out that in those neighborhoods and in those groups of people, there are gifts.
Yes. And that's, in the social sciences, it's the difference between asset-based or deficit-based perspective on a neighborhood. Basically, do you notice things that are missing, are wrong, are broken, or do you notice things that are good and that are a blessing? And that's pretty key. What the research tells us is that community development, or making changes in the neighborhood or the community for the long run, come when you use the gifts that are already there, right? Because God has put all these gifts, and he creates all of us fearfully and wonderfully, even our non-Christian neighbors, right?
Right.
And he's given us all gifts. And so one of the things that we encourage people, and I talk about this in the book, is to look for the gifts, right? And so like we've developed this neighborhood gift map that says, here's 6 different types of neighborhood gifts. Mm-hmm. Just to give us like a framework, rather than seeing like, oh, this person has weeds in their yard, or these sidewalks are busted up. Like, instead of just noticing that, like, to go through this map, it's just a little simple tool that helps people go, oh, here's some assets we have, here's some gifts that we have. And when you see those, boy, it's a very different starting place.
Now, where can they find that information at? Is that in the book?
So the field guide, the Hopeful Neighborhood Field Guide, has that tool, different tools in it, but one of the tools it has is this this kind of neighborhood asset map. And then we're launching this whole nationwide network of neighbors who want to make a difference in their neighborhood.
Oh, awesome.
Called the Hopeful Neighborhood Project. And so if people go to hopefulneighborhood.org, like the map that I just told you about, like different tools for learning about your neighborhood or how to make a difference, how to figure out what the gifts are, how to do a project, how to gather neighbors together. We got all kinds of tools and resources and helpful things uh, to help people do it. It's hard to get started. So sometimes it helps to have some tools or a simple framework or model to kind of take your first steps.
Well, and that's very helpful because, like you said, everybody has, I feel like, has a desire that their neighborhood be good,
Yeah, that's
and
right.
this
Yeah.
this gives them some tools that are
Yeah.
practical and they can put their hands on to make that next step.
Yeah.
So how would you say that? Obviously, it's good to look at the good things in a
Yeah.
community, but that's not very easy. I mean, you look at all the houses that are run down, or the weeds, or
That's right.
sometimes the
That's right.
people. So, how do you train your mind to start looking at the possibilities?
Sometimes it's just being conscious of it, right? So that's one of the things that we've found is when you help people just name. Do you
Right.
notice that when you look around, you notice things are wrong? It's like, oh yeah, I do. I do that. So part of it's just becoming conscious of it.
Yeah.
And then some of it for us is baked into our theology, right? So like we actually believe as Christians, right? We that like we say in the Apostles' Creed, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth.
Right. Right.
He has made everyone. He has made everything. And so that as Christians, that should bias us to say every single neighbor that I have is fearfully and wonderfully made. And God has entrusted them with gifts, and he calls them to use those gifts, even if they don't know him, even if they don't know where those gifts came from.
Right.
And so our theology also should help us like look for what are the gifts people have, what are the gifts around us, and then starting from there.
Well, that I feel like that would really help you look at people differently.
Yes.
When you look at them and say, wow, this is someone who God has made. And it's not only someone whom God has fearfully made, but it's someone that God killed his son for. So if God invested that much in that person, then I should treat that person, as something good. So that's a great point there. So how, what is like a practical example of how we all have different gifts, So what's a practical example of how we can use our gifts to pursue the common good in our neighborhood?
Great. Yeah. Great question. This network that we just launched, we're already starting to have really fun stories come in of people using their gifts to help. So I'll share one with you. Someone shared that their daughter is very like loves people and is very extroverted.
Right.
And they also but they don't have a lot of kids in their neighborhood. There's a lot of older people in their neighborhood. So you could look at that and say, man, there's no kids in the neighborhood, right? There's a deficit.
Right.
But instead what they said was, our daughter loves people. And so what the daughter started to do was meet her neighbors, and then she would start writing them letters. Who writes letters anymore, right? Like she would write a letter, put it in their mailbox, and because she just likes people. So she's using her like extroverted gifts as this child. She started to get to know some of her neighbors, found out that one of her neighbors who had been lonely, doesn't have a lot of relationships, knows a lot about baking. Well, this girl wants to learn how to bake. So now this elderly neighbor is using her baking gifts to teach this young girl how to bake. The young girl is getting to write letters. She feels better about herself, and they have this beautiful relationship. But it all came from just, rather than focusing on, there's no kids, or,
right.
Instead of focusing on that, saying, okay, our daughter like has this high energy for people. How could we have her use that gift? And then instead of looking at the neighbor as someone who, is needy, looking at the neighbor as someone who has gifts. What are your gifts? Oh, you know how to bake. I want to know how to bake. So simple, right, Matthew? But like God has gifted us. And when we start using those things and sharing those with other people, pretty cool stuff happens.
Well, I love that, because obviously maybe writing a letter and using baked goods and stuff, we don't think about that as something that's very heavily spiritual, of building the kingdom of God. But what that little girl is doing is she is building trust, just like what you're talked about. And she is building a platform for people to look at Christians as, hey, these are people that love people and can be trusted. So that is a good point. And so in chapter 3, you point out that joining with neighbors to bless the community is not a high priority in most churches. And so what is your advice for a church to improve in this area? And also, what are the rewards that they will benefit?
Yeah, great question. Great question. Yeah, the research backs us up. We did kind of nationwide research and kind of found out it's not a huge emphasis for churches to love or encourage people to love their neighborhood. So here's a couple practical ideas. I know a few churches who have started to reorganize their small groups or their small group structures geographically. And so they call them parishes, you know, kind of that older concept kind of started with Wesley of kind of your parish is like, that's draw a circle from your house, right? You draw it around and okay, the people in here I want to care about. So I am friends with people who are in churches who've reorganized their small group structure to say everyone who lives close to each other, you're doing Bible study together, you're doing outreach together, etc., and you're doing it in your parish, quote unquote, right, in that neighborhood. That's a tough shift because it moved some people out of small groups that they were just with their friends. So it made it more multi-generational. So that's one practical thing. That's kind of a bigger one. A smaller step would be for a pastor or church leaders to just take the lead in this, right? And to start doing stuff in their neighborhood, get to know their neighbors more, reach out to their neighbors. And like I'm a pastor, right? Preaching every week. And when we use examples or stories from our lives, what if more pastors, in the sermon said, it's like last week. Right. When I went to my neighbor's house, we needed some milk and we thought, instead of going down to the store, I'm just going to go across the street because all I need is a cup of milk, and it gives me an opportunity to talk to my neighbor. Like if our leaders are starting to get to know their neighborhoods and do something in their neighborhoods, and they kind of talk about those stories, that also could help churches kind of realize, oh, that's a way of being faithful, that's a way of proclaiming the gospel in word and in deed. And what will people get out of it? I mean, the great thing is we're seeing genuine relationships where you're going to bump into each other more often, because you're doing stuff with people that are right around you. Great friendships, and opportunities to build trust with non-Christians. I mean, I've done a lot of evangelism training, Matthew, at churches, and one of the biggest problems people always have is, because I'll talk about relational, how do you walk with someone where they are. The biggest thing people run into is they say, I actually don't have any friends who aren't Christian.
That's right.
So reaching out in your neighborhood is a wonderful, one of the pieces of fruit that comes from it is actually having friends who are different than us.
Wow. And that's an interesting point, because people do say that a lot, but in reality, there are, tons of people around them that don't know Jesus in their neighborhood. And right. I love the example about, you need some milk or something, go down and bark. Because I mean, you can translate that from needing this bacon ingredient to building this relationship with this person. And then that person wants to come to the church you go to. So that's really good. And I like the leaders lead by example, and then I think the key about that is when they see the leaders and the pastors doing this, and not only doing this, but saying, look, like, this is working. Like, these people, person right here came to our church today because I needed some milk and because I fed them supper in my house. I mean, and also I think it breaks down the idea that, you have to be this big missionary type that knows everything about the Bible.
Yeah, that's right. And that's heavy. To labor under, I have to go and bring up Jesus and answer everyone's questions.
Right.
How about build relationships? How about stand shoulder to shoulder with your neighbors and try to make a difference in your neighborhood together? Boy, and once those bridges are built, Jesus said, don't hide your light. but don't put it under a basket. And then what did he say? He said, let people see your good deeds and they will give glory to your Father who's in heaven. So there's something about doing good that can have spiritual fruits. In Jesus said it,
Well, and that's a good point. I feel like sometimes we can get so caught up in the things that go on inside the church walls
Yes.
that may be good, but all these people out
Yeah.
here, that they don't see that. They don't see any of that. And so I love the idea of what you're talking about, and what, obviously Jesus talked about is when the neighborhood sees that we care about the neighborhood, we want good for people, and we want them to be saved, then that becomes a difference maker, and the church benefits.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So now I really was interested in this information you pointed out in chapter 4 about how advertising has shifted from commercials content to influencers. And so what can we as Christians learn from this approach in relation to living for God's glory?
It's interesting because, the latest, smartest advertisers have realized, rather than having a slick commercial made by professionals.
Yes.
If you have someone, an influencer, right? So they have people, follow them on social media or whatever. It's just a genuine person who's like, hey, I like this.
Right. Yeah.
But what they've found is they don't have to be slick. They don't have to use good arguments, because the reason it works is because they can smell a genuine connection between someone and this product, right? Rather than this slick advertisement. I just think that's like what we have to learn from that is like, go back to our roots, right? Jesus didn't say, you will be my marketers, develop some good programs or schemes or billboards that will whatever. He said, you are my witnesses. And what do witnesses do? Witnesses, we're not even the prosecuting attorney. The witness just says what they've seen, right? And what they've experienced. And so I think for us to return to be people who, rather than promoting just programs or like really slick, books, and I'm saying that as an author, right?
Oh yeah.
What does it mean for us to say, I'm an influencer? Like, I want people to smell my genuine affection for Jesus, and for them to just pick up on that in my life. That's actually what we originally, we're called to be about. And, the early church, one of the things said about the earliest Christians. So for this book, we did a lot of research on kind of the writings around the time of the early church. One of the phrases that really stood out to me that someone used early on when they were talking about Christians is they said they have very eloquent behavior. Not eloquent words. They said they have eloquent behavior. So there was something about how they lived. Loving their enemies was a big thing because they were persecuted, right? And yet they responded with love. There were epidemics and pandemics at the time, and Christians responded with compassion. And so the world around saw these Christians and how they were living, and they said, your life is a message, and I like the sound of it. Isn't that fascinating? So how could we be more like that,
Well, and that's really true. And I always think about the fact that sometimes we struggle, with sharing the gospel. But if we have come to the point to where we have accepted Christ, we know our story, and so I feel like that, like what you're talking about when it comes to influencing people, just like these influencers have people in their circle
that's right.
These people, they trust these influencers. I mean, all they got to do is say, hey, I use this kind of eyeliner, I use this kind of shopping place, and boom, all them followers automatically trust that. And so like you was talking about earlier, and what the book talks about, when we pursue the common good, we create these followers that trust us. And then when we share the story of how the gospel influenced us, then that is the tipping point for these other people.
Yeah.
So that was really good, because I feel like as a pastor, or an
Mm-hmm.
author, and be people like that, like us, well, you're really focused on content. You're like, get this
Yes.
good content out here, and it's going to change, people's lives, and it is good. But we
Yeah.
also have to realize there's this other part to it that you have pointed out, and
Yeah.
so what, in your opinion, is the
Yeah.
biggest lesson that we can learn from the early church in the way that they ministered and gave God glory successfully?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would have to be with it would be more about their behavior than their words.
Right.
That they were known as people who cared for the poor. They were known as people who went and saved babies who had been abandoned on the outskirts of town. They were known for adoption, in other words.
Wow.
They were known for loving their enemies, and that's not in theory, right? That's not in social media. That's like their neighbors were persecuting them, and they responded with love. So they were known. It's like when Jesus said, who cares if you love people who love you? Big deal.
Yes.
Everyone does that. So I think the biggest thing was they followed Jesus. They lived out his ways, and that led to opportunities to talk about it. And I think that's a great model for us. I think in particular, because right now there's not a lot of trust for Christians or for the church, like there used to be.
Correct.
And I think because of that, if we lead with our behavior, with proclaiming the gospel in deed, then we will gain a hearing to be able to proclaim the gospel in word. And so I think we should look at the early church and be like, man, I want to be a little bit more like that. I want to have eloquent behavior.
Yes. And that's a good point. People, we gain people's trust through our behavior, and I can think about one time when I was in college, I had a communications class, and that's not a good class for a preacher, because preachers like to preach,
That's
and
right.
So that's what I did. I tried to preach, and I had this professor that was from like Berkeley, California. I mean, just very, very liberal, just did not like God, did not like Christianity. But when I did exactly like this idea of what you're talking about, man, it was amazing. It was amazing how big of an influence I had over the class, because even though this teacher was berating me and was like treating me horribly and pointing me out in class and doing all this stuff, I had like people from other faiths, people that didn't like the Christian life, all this, they would come to me and they would ask, how are you so peaceful? Like how can you be loving in that atmosphere? And so you're definitely right. So another thing that I really liked, and it talks about in the book, that there is a shift that education is making from a single teacher that lectures to a more collaborative approach. And I really love this idea. Could you explain how we as Christians could benefit from this approach in pursuing the common good in our neighborhood?
Yeah, I would say the thing I would say is, social learning is like, well, we can all learn from each other by interacting and all that.
Correct.
And I think for Christians, one of the things that we can benefit from is recognizing that it's okay to collaborate with and partner with non-Christians in our neighborhoods, right? They are fearfully and wonderfully made by God. They're made in the image of God. They're given gifts and they're called by God to use them in their calling, right? So how can we, because, a lot of times we're tempted to feel like we Christians are going to go help those people, right? We are going to go help whatever it is. We are going to go help the poor. We are going to go help the non-Christians, whatever it is. I think for us to like embrace standing shoulder to shoulder with non-Christians and doing stuff with them, that isn't to say like that we like, give up what we believe. And I'm not saying anything about that. I'm just saying to partner in pursuing the common good of the neighborhood with our neighbors. It shows respect to our neighbors. It builds relationships. It encourages them. And boy, I just think that, I think if we do that, we will have the relationships where more and more, like how your classmates were coming up to you, Matthew, like we need more of that in the church. We need more where we're in relationships with non-Christians and they're coming to us and saying, how did you handle that with such peace? Or where do you get your energy? Or how come you were able to forgive that guy who was so mean to you? Whatever it is, right? Peter said, be prepared for when they ask you for the source of the hope that's inside of you. So we are going to have to use words.
Oh, yes, yes.
The gospel does need to be proclaimed and explained and all that sort of thing. But boy, if we stand shoulder to shoulder in genuine relationships and partnerships with non-Christians, I believe the doors will open for that.
Well, and I think a good point is, maybe not everybody in the world can get on board with, maybe building a church, or teaching Sunday school, when you're non-Christian. But when you're talking about the common good of like, hey, let's help orphans, let's feed these hungry people. Let's, help people who are stuck in human trafficking. Let's do all this stuff to make our world better. I think the number one thing that does is that takes us as Christians who have the resurrected Jesus within our lives, and that places us as missionaries where all of these people are at. And as we are working side by side with them, they begin to say, like you said, well, these Christians are kind of good people. So maybe I need to know their Jesus. So that is that is a great idea. And one of the things that stuck out in this book is that, we all want our neighborhood to get better, but a lot of times churches go at it from the perspective of just telling them what needs to change, and what I love about the book is it calls us to go out there and do something about it. So,
and like you said, there's something for everyone. It could be as small as getting to know your neighborhoods. We developed a little bingo board. Every square has a little activity you can do to get to know your neighbors better. And so you could, like with your small group, say, we're just going to play neighborhood bingo and see who gets bingo first. It could be something small like that, just getting reacquainted with your neighborhood. We have coaches who are willing to work with people who want to do like an actual project, right? Gather people together and do a big project. So we have coaches for that. We have an online process. Because really, Matthew, this is all play. Like anyone can pursue the common good. It can be done in a tiny little way. Yep.
Well, Mr. Don, thank you for coming on the Kingdom Builders podcast. And your book is really good. It's very good. And I'm going to put a link in the description to where all our listeners can find your book and get your information. And what was the name of that website that has all those resources again?
Yep. hopefulneighborhood.org.
Okay, hopefulneighborhood.org, so they can take those next steps there. But thank you for listening to Kingdom Builders and learn how to live on mission for God. As you go throughout this week, may we discover, as we talked about today, how to produce and live in a hopeful neighborhood. Thank you and goodbye. Well, thank you for coming on my podcast.